heard about this meeting. And at that, Meryl, would you please introduce our guest speaker tonight, Erica Gies?
I'm happy to. So Erica Gies is an independent journalist. She covers science and the environment, and she's been published in New York Times, Scientific American, Nature, National Geographic, and quite a number of other publications. She's coming to us today from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, a city that I actually went to last summer for reporting on my own article, so I know how beautiful it is. And she also lives in San Francisco. And most relevant tonight, and the reason I in particular was very excited to have Erica speak to us, is that she's the author of this fantastic book that I read cover to cover and learned so much. It's called Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, published by the University of Chicago Press. And the book is so good that it won the National Sierra Club's Rachel Carson Award for Excellence in Environmental Journalism last year. And it has 5-star ratings on Amazon. So it can be purchased through Amazon if you aren't lucky enough to win it as the mystery question answer. I'm going to put the link in the chat for where you can find the book, or if you prefer to purchase from independent bookstores, I will also put the link to IndieBound, which enables you to find bookstores in the area that might have it. So welcome, Erica. Thank you so much for coming, and really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Meryl. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, I was so honored that to have Sierra Club recognize my book. And let's see, I'm gonna share my screen here, hopefully. All right, and let me get rid of that. Oops. All right, can people see it? The lady in the boat?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes,
great.
we can.
So in this time of climate change, we're seeing increasingly severe and frequent flood and drought. And we're also seeing that our standard approach of trying to control water, manage it by controlling it, is failing increasingly often. And in the dominant culture, we tend to want to control it because we think of it either as a commodity if we don't have enough, or a threat if we're worried about flooding. So in that way, we're really thinking of water as a thing, a what. But that approach is not innately human. Not all humans think that way. And many indigenous and land-based cultures around the world instead view water as a who, a friend or a relative. And that allows them to better understand water's complex relationships with soil and rock and microbes and plants and beavers and people. And they also understand that with the right to water, there's a responsibility for caretaking. People are part of the system. And so we can't just take, we also have to take care of those systems. And in researching my book, I traveled all around the world. And this woman I met in the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq. And she is with the Medan culture, or marsh dwellers. And they have a 9,000-year-old culture of living atop the wetlands. And to them, water is simply life, the source of everything that they need. So the primary building material they use is Phragmites australis, and you can see that in her boat here and in the reeds behind her. And it turns into things like this. This is their beautiful community center, and it's built almost entirely of the Phragmites reed. And during the 9,000 years that this civilization has lived in coexistence with the wetlands, many irrigated civilizations have come and gone. And when those civilizations fell, the water would retake their marshlands again. And the longevity of their culture really pales in comparison to our own. And I think it's worth asking why. And the way that they relate to water, I think, is part of it. So today, when we have floods and droughts around the world, these are both from California, which is where I'm from, both not too far from Sacramento, flood year and a drought year. And we often hear that, well, our infrastructure isn't built for these extremes. And then people call for more infrastructure, more control, higher levees, bigger drains, longer aqueducts. But more of the same isn't going to help. Climate change is beginning to be blamed for these floods and droughts, and climate change is definitely a factor. However, there are other factors which are getting less attention and that we arguably have more control, more ability to fix. And that is the destruction of land and other species, which are affecting both the water cycle, these water extremes, and climate itself. So that's a critical fact that's widely ignored. It's our development that causes this destruction that is actually part of the problem, not just the kind of concrete infrastructure that we use to control water, but also urban sprawl, industrial, agriculture, and forestry. So in the dominant culture, we really tend toward single focus problem solving. You know, if we're worried about water scarcity, we build the dam and we bring in water from somewhere else. If we're worried about flooding, we build a levee. But putting ourselves first in this way isn't working. These single focus problems ignore water's agency and relationships and therefore undermine them. And so they're in fact increasing the flood and drought that we're experiencing. So the scale at which we have interfered with the natural water cycle is not well understood. We've actually filled or drained as much as 87% of the world's wetlands. We've dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers, and the land area covered by pavement in our cities has doubled just since 1992. Deforestation is decreasing rain around the world, and it is increasing the power of hurricanes and typhoons. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You know, hurricanes are a concern in Florida. And the droughts that we're experiencing are partly due to the way in which we've dramatically dried out the landscape by killing beavers, levying rivers, cutting them off from their floodplains, overgrazing cattle, deforestation, and overpumping of groundwater. So instead of trying to solve one problem at a time, the water detectives that I met while researching my book, and these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, indigenous peoples, urban planners, farmers, ranchers, foresters, they are instead asking a radical question, which is, what does water want? And what I've come to understand is that what water wants is a return of its slow phases that are particularly prone to our disruption with development. These are wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, and forests, which naturally absorb floods. They clean water, they store water for later, make it available during the dry season. They store carbon dioxide, and they support many forms of life that in fact in turn maintain the natural systems that support us. So all around the world, I found people who are innovating ways to collaborate with water. And I came to think of this as the slow water movement. And this is because they are largely speaking, trying to conserve the remaining wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, and forests, or restore them, or mimic them in some way. And I coined slow water thinking about the slow food movement. And like slow food, the slow water movement, solutions are each unique to the place that they exist. They seek to work with local geology, ecology, and cultures. They deploy systems thinking rather than single focus problem solving. They are distributed across the landscape rather than centralized like our standard water management. And that makes sense when you think of that 87% of world's wetlands that have been eradicated. You need lots of small places scattered across the landscape to make up for that loss. Slow water projects are ideally local, making the most of the water availability in the region. They are socially just. So our standard water can be environmentally unjust. We are probably familiar with the idea that a levee cuts off a river from a floodplain, and so the water doesn't have as much area to flatten out, so it raises up within the river channel, and that can increase flood risk on a neighboring community who perhaps can't afford a levee. Dams are also an environmental justice issue. A 40-year survey found that they brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. And we may think of the receivers of that as being the fortunate ones, but in fact, they too are made more vulnerable with this standard water infrastructure. So there's something called the levee effect. And when you build a levee, you give people a false sense of security that behind the levee is safe. And so I think of the 1993 flood along the Mississippi, where St. Louis built a 500-year levee in an area that flooded, and they got tons of new development, businesses, houses right behind. And, you know, water people joke that levees, there are two kinds of levees, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. So you may not have flooding as often, but then there is going to be flooding eventually, and you've put more people at risk. Similarly, with dams bringing in water from somewhere else, you encourage more development. More supply just increases demand. It's very much like when you build new lanes on the highway and it just attracts more traffic. It doesn't resolve gridlock. And so, you know, we've seen this in California as we've built more and more water infrastructure. We've attracted more agriculture, like more than the area can support, more businesses, more homes. And so you're just putting more people, making them more susceptible to scarcity in a place that doesn't have enough water to support that many people. And the last tenet of the slow water movement is that it engages the community with care for water. And that can be hands-on, as I found in many places around the world, or it can be more of an educational component where there's signage explaining to people. Maybe you have an industrial site along a river in a city that's gone away, and that area has been remediated and turned into a park that people can enjoy, but then it's also available to absorb water when waters run high. And so signage in the park might inform people of what water is doing in that area. So most slow water projects start with something called historical ecology, and that's basically trying to figure out what water did in your area before it was radically altered by people. And that's because water has a memory. It's inclined to go where it wants to go, which is where it used to go. And so by doing this, this picture is of South Seattle, and you can see the Duwamish River when there was just a little bit of settlement, and today where it's been largely straightened and built right up to the edge. And that's common in many, many places around the world, if the stream or river isn't just buried. But figuring out, mapping historical water allows governments, city governments, regional governments to make long-term plans. Because we tend to think that our cities are fixed, they're already built, there's nothing we can do. But in fact, a lot of buildings turn over time within 50 years or less. And so by making a plan, you can decide, okay, well, when that building comes down, maybe we won't build something else that's going to be at risk of flooding. Maybe we will instead create or restore a wetland that's going to help absorb that flood and reduce flood risk from other people nearby. So, you know, there's kind of a prevailing attitude that nature-based solutions are nice, but they can't be a significant part of the solution. But that's really a fundamental misunderstanding of scale. Because these solutions are not centralized, but scattered across the landscape, it's like renewable energy, how solar panels on everyone's roof can add up to a lot of electricity. Similarly, you can start small with the project that you have right in your area, and maybe your neighbors do it and their neighbors do it, and cumulatively, it just increases the impact, the positive impact. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of projects. This one was in Seattle, where they used historical ecology to plan out how to restore a portion of Thornton Creek, which was regularly flooding a road, a high school, and homes. And this is an 11-mile creek that cuts across an area where about 70,000 people live. And the projects were just 1,600 feet of that whole 11 miles. But because they had used historical ecology, the places that they chose, in fact, were historical floodplains. So by returning space to the river, they really had an outsized impact. And so, as I said, a lot of streams are buried. Baltimore is like 75% of creeks are buried. I think that's pretty common around the world. And where streams remain at the surface, they often look like this. First the riparian corridor was cut down, and so water started flowing faster and people were worried about flooding. So they straightened the channel to move the water off the land faster, and that started creating fast water and erosion. And so then they armored or sandbagged the banks to prevent that. And so basically, ecologists call this urban stream syndrome, and it's marked by flash floods because the rain can't soak in the ground on the pavement. It's all rushing into this channel at once. Unstable banks, heavy pollution from the urban runoff, and not very much life. And so restoration projects have typically involved taking out the concrete, making it a little more sinuous like it would be naturally, putting in some plants, maybe some rocks and wood, make it look kind of habitat-y. But restorationists have found that the life that returns is not very diverse. It's sort of a crows and cockroaches kind of situation. And it required a lot of ongoing maintenance. The stream wasn't able to maintain itself. So a biologist in Seattle named Catherine Lynch realized something. It's not just the stream that we see on the surface. The stream is much bigger than just that channel. In fact, there's another stream that's flowing underneath, and this is not the aquifer or the groundwater, but something called the hyporeic zone. And it's moving downstream through soil and rock, but orders of magnitude more slowly than the water at the surface. And the hyporeic zone is really critical to the stream's health. It can extend a mile from the banks of large rivers. It can be 30 feet from the banks on a small stream. And it's populated by microbes, crustaceans, worms, and aquatic insects. And it really plays a pivotal role in nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycles. So it's kind of like the stream's gut microbiome. And just like when humans don't have very diverse flora in their guts, we get sick, and the same is true for streams. And with that fast water created by an urban system, it just scours away all that soft material at the bottom where the hyporeic zone exists. And so she thought, let's try to rebuild this missing hyporeic zone and repopulate it with the critters who are missing. And this was a first in the world attempt to do this. And here's Catherine Lynch in front with the purple jacket. You can see the project shortly after they finished it. And it was hard to convince the bean counters in the city to do this project because nobody had ever done it before. And so she convinced them to partner with scientists at the local university to do some studies so that they could learn about how effective it was and how they might do it better in the future. And so one was like a physical study. Was the water moving down into the hyporeic zone? And they found that yes, it was 89 times more than before they did the project. Another issue was pollution. So, all of these pollutants run off of the pavement and into the channel, and they're not regulated because they're non-point source pollution. And they measured how many, and there were more than 1,900. And these are things like lawn fertilizer, brake pad dust, et cetera, just things that are in our human environment. And they found that spending 3 hours in a 15-foot stretch of the hyporeic zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. And then there was the biological question, like how many critters would be there? And the restorationists have tended to have this attitude of, if we build it, they will come. But as one of my sources told me, when your headwaters are a Home Depot parking lot, they're not coming. And so that's why they did this inoculation of critters they took from a wilder stream nearby. They put these little tubes into the hyporheic zone and let it sit there so the critters could climb aboard, and then put them into the stream bed of the restored creek. And they found that the restored sections indeed did have 7 times more crustaceans, worms, and insects, and much greater species diversity. So some other markers of success, the city hasn't flooded since they did this project. Because they returned the floodplains have been working as intended to absorb floods. Neighbors love this area. Educational events happen there. The stream flow and temperature are more consistent year round, because even in the dry season, the water is there supplying the stream from below. And in sort of the ultimate mark of success, Chinook salmon came and spawned in the hyporheic zone that they had created. And so now Seattle is doing this on other streams. They're getting a lot of interest from other cities around the world asking how they did this. And it really shows how you can start small on just the 1,600-foot project and then cumulatively add to that. I want to talk next about forests. I know Florida doesn't have a landscape like this. I took this in British Columbia, but you do have a lot of pine forests, and a lot of those are being used as plantations for pellet wood. And so forest management or mismanagement is another major way in which we've disrupted the global water cycle. Tree roots help water move underground, which reduces flooding. Trees also create rain. They lift up that groundwater and release it into the air as water vapor. And we hear a lot about how climate is affecting the water cycle, increasing flood and drought, but water and plants are also affecting climate. Water phase changes from gas to liquid is one of the major ways that Earth releases heat. And the healthy life and water systems help to balance the water cycle, which buffers these water extremes and also helps keep the climate stable. So scientists used to think that most rain came from evaporation over the ocean, but they now understand that evapotranspiration, release of water from soil and plants, in fact, contributes on average 40% of rain over continents. And on the East Coast of the United States, it's 70 or 80% because it's moving west to east. And then when that rain falls, it can be recycled locally, regionally, or even globally. If it moves into the jet stream, deforestation can actually cause drought on the other side of the world. And a healthy forest can provide rain. Another way that forests help to create rain, not just through releasing water, but they're also releasing little bacteria and fungal spores that help the rain to nucleate and form. And their rough surface slows the wind, which also helps the rain to nucleate into rain. So an important new finding, not totally new, but still not well known, is that people used to think that the temperature difference between ocean and land is what pulled the water in. So people thought trees grow where rain falls. But an atmospheric physicist named Anastasia Makariva has found that, in fact, forests pull in the rain that they need. And that's because as their vapor that they release condenses into clouds, it decreases local air pressure, which draws in more moist air from elsewhere. And she calls this the biotic pump. And so if you don't have healthy ecosystems from ocean to inland, you can break that precipitation recycling. You can break that chain and have more drought inland. And she's also done some papers that have linked deforestation to the increase in frequency and intensity of hurricanes and cyclones. And that's because if you're not bringing that water in over the land, it's remaining over the ocean. And so therefore you're having bigger storms there. So maintaining forests is really important, and logged forests, clear-cut forests, same species that are maintained for regular logging, for example, don't perform this function as well because they're not the complex intact ecosystem that evolved together to bring in this water that they need. This is a photograph of a forest in Kenya that was deforested by smallholder farmers and then reforested with native plants. And these principles about trees, like I said, they're really emerging science, but people who live close to the land know this as conventional wisdom. And in fact, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya, Wangari Maathai, said, if you destroy the forest, the river will stop flowing, the rains will become irregular, the crops will fail. And when I was in Kenya, I met people who had seen their streams and springs disappear as forests around them were felled. And then forest restoration and water-savvy farming techniques that held water on the land, that slow water concept, brought them back. I met a farmer who showed me the spring that had come back on her land. So there's a lot of talk now when you hear about nature-based solutions about planting trees for carbon storage. But most of these projects are, again, they're single focus. They're not considering the water cycle at all. So if people are planting fast-growing plantations of pines or eucalyptus with the idea, oh, they grow so fast, they'll store more carbon more efficiently, you know, that might take too much local water if those aren't plants that are local to the area, and also if they are a monoculture plantation. Researchers have found that instead it's better to spend money protecting an area, providing alternative livelihoods to people who might be destroying it, and basically letting trees and plants replant themselves. If the seed bank is still in the soil, you know, they can best decide, you know, who should live where. And restoration done well in this way can, in fact, improve river flows and underground water flows for long distances away. The scientist who innovated the biotic pump, the Makariva, she said, the most important thing we can do to protect human communities is to protect old growth forests and connected vegetated lands. Simply stopping their ongoing destruction will slow down climate destabilization. And she has a lot of emerging work now that is looking at the climate stabilizing impact of these intact ecosystems, because humans have degraded more than 75% of the land area on Earth. So, you know, we just don't have that buffer. That's not to say that carbon dioxide is not a big factor in climate change. It absolutely is. But when you have healthy, intact ecosystems that are better regulating the water cycle, they're also regulating climate. So they're reducing the impact of that excess carbon dioxide. So it's very important that we do both things: get off fossil fuels, reduce carbon dioxide, and restore natural ecosystems. So I mentioned earlier that there had been a doubling of urban areas since 1992. China is a place that has seen incredibly rapid urbanization. I know Florida has seen really rapid development as well over several decades. And over a 3-year period, 62% of China's cities flooded, costing more than 100 billion in economic losses. And this is really common. There was a survey of city managers around the United States, and 82% of them had experienced flooding. And another issue with cities can be overpumping of groundwater. So Beijing has seen this, Mexico City has seen this. And when you pump too much groundwater, the city can sink, and that can cause a lot of problems too. So a landscape architect in China has become pretty well known around the world. His name is Yu Kongxiong, and he came up with this idea called sponge cities. And it's a slow water concept of finding places within the city to allow water to slow on the ground and infiltrate again. And he studied landscape architecture at Harvard, but he grew up on a communal farm in China under the Mao era. And he really sees flooding as a friend. Water is a friend that brings nutrients and fish to the land. And so the president of China, Xi Jinping, became very interested in the sponge cities idea and made it a national policy. And it's now been rolled out in more than 500 cities across China. And the goal by 2030 is for within these projects to capture 70% of rain on site. And before the projects began, they were only capturing 10% of rain on site. And I think that's pretty standard if you think of how many paved areas you have within a city. So this is a project that the landscape architect did. And this is how it is in a dry period. And this is what it looks like in flood. So you can see all of this area is a park that people can use when it's dry, and this area along the river banks as well. And then that area can be flooded when the waters run high without causing a lot of damage. And, you know, he often has these little pathways so that people can engage, you know, even if it's muddy or wet, people can still engage in the landscape. And you know, there have been some headlines from China saying, you know, there was a huge flood, hundreds of people died, maybe sponge cities doesn't work. But these projects are still only maybe 5 square miles in a city that might cover 1,000 square miles. So it's not hard to understand why we're not yet at the scale that is necessary to really absorb all the water that's coming, because there's so much space that we've taken away from water. But Yu Kongjiang has an idea of sponge continent, sponge planet, with the idea of making as much area as possible permeable and open to water. And he calls this big feet aesthetics. And if you're familiar with Chinese history, there was a period in which women's feet would be bound to be really tiny because that was considered to be beautiful. And it was considered beautiful because they couldn't walk, they couldn't work, they were too rich to work. And so what he's saying is, like, a lot of our landscapes that are populated with ornamental plants are not serving a function. And what we need instead are native plants, absorbent areas that can live on the rain that's available, that can absorb floods, or like urban food forests that are doing something useful, like providing food. So what can we do about our own private landscapes? Lawns are the largest irrigated crop in North America. They use more than 9 billion gallons of water every day. And they're basically an ecological desert. Not much can live in them. They require fertilizers and pesticides that further pollute water. And so this picture on the left with the purple flowers, it's on my left. I think it might be on your left too. That is my yard in San Francisco, which I converted to native plants. And I did that because water scarcity is a big problem in California, and I wanted plants that would not require any supplemental water, and they do not. I never water this, literally never. And since I've done it, I also use 0 pesticides, 0 fertilizers. I just do a little bit of weeding by hand, pruning, that's it. And it's amazing to sit back there and see all of the bumblebees. I've found native salamanders. There are tons of birds there, little voles and animals. And it's just really a very special place. And, you know, I think it's worth asking, like, why do we have lawns anyway? I mean, lawns are great for playing soccer on or for kids to run around on. But other than that, we have so many lawns that are serving no purpose. They're sort of this homage to English aristocratic estates. And why don't we instead embrace the place that we live? Like, a lot of us live in a particular place because we love it. And so getting to know its native plants and what that landscape actually looks like and bringing that into our own human environments can be really, really rewarding. I've found it to be. And so, you know, urban flooding, another approach that's a little less grand than what Yu Kongxiang is doing in China is this picture on the right. This is a bioswale in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it can be very helpful to absorb water, and it can also reduce pollution. Like we have a lot of combined sewer overflows where rainwater is going into sewers and there isn't time to treat it. And so we're releasing untreated sewage into rivers. Anything that's permeable is going to slow the rate at which that water is rushing into storm drains. And so it's a major technique that's being used in cities like Philadelphia and Detroit, rather than having to put billions into like yet more stormwater retention. They're instead restoring these kinds of green spaces. And again, you know, you need to think of scale, like it should be throughout the whole urban landscape, but every little bit helps, and they are scalable, like solar panels on everyone's roof, adding up to a lot of electricity. And using historical ecology, finding places where water is likely to kind of pond and pool can also be very helpful. So here are my book was also published in the UK and in China. And so, you know, sooner or later, water always wins. And so in the face of climate change and ecosystem collapse and water scarcity, it's really time to shift our relationship with water to thinking of how we can take care of the natural systems that naturally modulate water problems. If we can let go of our impulse for control and collaborate with water, we can win too. And I think that climate change and the degradation of natural systems can feel really overwhelming. And we're often kind of waiting for international leaders to agree and do something. But the thing that's so exciting about slow water projects is that they are something that we can do in our own community with our neighbors that can help make our own communities more resilient to flood and drought and climate change. There's also an important cooling effect of restoring ecosystems, which I didn't even really get into. But I think we're out of time, so I'll leave it there. If you want to find out more, this is my website. And I hope as you're going through your day and moving around your own place, that you will have curiosity toward water and ask, what does water want? And how can we make space for water in our own places? Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was fascinating. I know in South Florida here, we obviously have engineered a lot of our water, but one thing that I'm involved in a project where we take in a program, the program Linda mentioned, where we take kids out on nature outings, and one place that we take them is to the Kissimmee River, where in the 1960s and 70s, the Army Corps of Engineers straightened it and made a canal out of it, and very shortly thereafter everything died. And so since the 90s they have spent a lot of money and a lot of years recreating the original Kissimmee River, and they've mostly done that at this point. So we take kids over to an area there where they can learn about what's come back and count some of the fish and birds and things like that. So we do have like one example here of how
that's really interesting.
letting water return can be helpful, but
yeah, that's funny what you say about like doing the damage and then trying to undo the damage. I talked to a woman who grew up in Wisconsin, and her grandfather had a home right near the river, and it was pretty natural, and like everybody had basements and nobody's basements ever flooded. And then at some point in the 80s, I guess they decided, to kind of, engineer the banks and make it sort of concrete. And then everybody started flooding. And so, 15 or 20 years later, then they took out everything that they had done.
Yeah, a lot of money goes into engineering and unengineering. So all right, if anybody has questions, you can just either raise your hand or jump in, and feel free to ask it. You can ask it in person. You don't have to put it in the chat. Just come off of mute.
Erica, I was curious to know what the different reactions to your publication through different cultures and countries was. In other words, were certain places more receptive than others?
Well, I mean, the book has only been published in English and in Chinese, so that somewhat limits, who can read it, unfortunately. I have had a lot of, I don't know, like if people don't like it, are they going to tell you? Most of what I've heard has been very positive. And I have heard things from US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, a little bit from India. And then the Chinese edition is newer. I think it came out last September, but I've been told that it's doing well there. So that's about all I know.
Why do you
It's
think China?
encouraging. Yeah.
Of all the
Why
different
China?
countries, why do you think China? Yeah.
Well, I think maybe because I have a chapter that focuses a fair bit on China, that might have made it more interesting to them. And it features Yu Kongjiang, and he's fairly well known in China. And in fact, they asked him to write the introduction to the Chinese edition, which is kind of fun. So I don't know. My agent has co-agents in a lot of different countries, and says, hey, do you want this book or that book? And so the people who picked it up were in the UK and in China.
Do you have any sense for why so much of the wetlands have been degraded? I mean, it seems to me that people are more interested in saving rivers than wetlands, even if they alter them
Yeah.
in many ways.
Well, I
Just
mean, people
curious what you found.
certainly in the dominant culture, by which I mean sort of Euro North American culture that's been exported around the world. I think people have long misunderstood wetlands. For in a lot of cultures, wetlands are understood as great providers of life, and people have accepted the fact that they change over the course of the year. Like in southern India, there are certain plants, food plants, that people would plant in the wetlands when they were dry, because there was still enough water underneath that would support their crops. So I think, people have understood how wetlands function in various ways, but then in the dominant culture, we have, and I think this might have come from the British, wetlands were seen as wastelands because you can't build on them, you can't grow food on them typically. And so if you're thinking of land as property rather than a common good, you're trying to maximize everything. And so I think that led to a desire to try to change wetlands into something that they're not. But it's very short-sighted, because we see, when I say that water has a memory, it's often buildings built on wetlands that are the first to flood. And so those developments are at risk, and often they are occupied by lower socioeconomic people who can't afford to live in a place that doesn't flood.
Yeah.
We're actually seeing that in Miami, the gentrification of the higher ground in Miami.
Yeah.
It used to be the more affordable property because everybody wanted to be on the coast, and
Yeah.
now people are starting to realize maybe not so much.
Yeah, for sure. There was a study I wrote about after the book came out that looked at floodplain encroachment, like people who are continuing to build on floodplains. It seems like kind of a no-brainer that you wouldn't want to do that. But this guy looked at trends around the world, and also since 1992, I think because that's a year when a good data set was begun. An area the size of Ukraine has been built on just since 1992. So we're continuing to build more and more on floodplains, and reduce space for water and make more and more people at risk from flooding. And not just the people in the floodplain. You know, when you take away a wetland or a floodplain, you're increasing flood risk for everyone else. And there was an economic study a couple of years ago that I also wrote about, where people looked at, you know, because we often hear about the private property right, like the recent Supreme Court decision that eradicated protections for like half of the wetlands remaining in the US. And, you know, well, it's their property, it's their right. Well, it's infringing on other people's rights. So this study found that if a community decided to protect a wetland for flood absorption and other purposes, rather than develop it, the return on investment from avoided flood damage costs was less than 5 years. And the impact extended more than 40 miles from the wetland that had been developed. And that was an average of a nationwide US-based analysis.
Wow. Yeah, that's good information for us as we keep trying to fight the development on wetlands down here. How far the impact goes, I think, is something that nobody thinks about.
Mm-hmm.
Any other
And
questions? Anybody want to jump in with a question?
Even the development of our farmlands, I mean, that's, you know, kind of we have to protect the farmlands as well as the wetlands, because buildings are the last crop for sure.
Well said. Yeah.
I want to remind everyone that this is Erica's book, Water Always Wins. It's an excellent book. I put the links in the chat again if you want to buy it on Amazon or if you want to buy it in independent bookstores. The second link is takes you to where it is in independent bookstores. And if no one has any questions, we can get to the mystery question. Also,
Yes.
if you haven't answered the question of how you heard about this meeting, we like to try to keep track. So unless you're a regular and we know how you heard of this meeting, please put that in the chat as well. But here comes the mystery question. Put your answer in the chat. All right, Linda's giving us a little sneak peek here. Humans have drained or filled what percentage of the world's wetlands? First person to answer correctly in the chat wins Erica's book. Humans have drained or filled what percentage of the world's wetlands? Ooh. Rose, 87%. Hope is second there with 85. Katie with 70, because no one can believe that it could be as high as it is. And Erica, if I'm not mistaken, Rose is the winner.
Yes, Rose is correct. And just to be clear, it should be, if you're citing it, you should say as much as 87%, because there is some uncertainty. And there have been, there's a little uncertainty because it's hard to know what was there a long time ago all over the world. But it's a pretty solid number.
One of the interesting things that I think that you mentioned is that water goes where water used to go, and you know, the memory of water, and you know, and obviously that's partly geological, where the water goes where it's easiest for the water to go. But it's just a very interesting concept because, you know, we never think about where water's been. We think about where we want to put it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people, you know, who have creeks, seasonal creeks that pop up in their basement, or, you know, people like, so in Toronto that happens, in San Francisco that happens. My mother-in-law's place in the suburbs of Boston has a sump pump, and every time it rains, the pump turns on because her place was built on a wetland. And that's the only way it stays dry, is to literally pump it out every single time it rains. And there's a lot of places like that.
I was just going to say that some pumps are very popular in certain areas because the basements fill with water. All right, last chance if anybody has any questions. Linda, you can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
if anybody else has
I'll
any
try to
questions.
get the wording of that question better.
Rose,
It
Linda,
just doesn't read right to my mind. I gotta figure out how
I
that
think
English works.
it's fine. Just like in the answer, just say as much as 87%.
Okay,
All right.
if
Rose, you
anyone
will-
has, yeah, Rose, I know your address, so you will be
getting the
receiving
book, and I highly
the
recommend you
book.
read it. And as Erica mentioned, if you do read the book, it would be helpful to at least give it the 5 stars or the stars on Amazon, but even more ideal is to write a review. So I will be doing that since I read the book. But if anybody else reads it, please be sure to review it on Amazon, which does help its rankings and visibility on the site. So
Thank you so much. I look forward to reading it.
Great. Thank you. And
Thank
thank
you,
you for
Erica.
inviting me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Erica.
Erica.
This was really interesting.
That was great. Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.